Greetings, fellow philosophers. In this brief little presentation, I want to talk to you about Plato and idealism. In any conversation about philosophy, you're going to run into some technical terms. We're not going to overload you with a lot of technical terms in this course, but I do want you to become familiar with at least a few of those. So we're going to talk about idealism. In this presentation, next, when we talk about Aristotle, we're going to talk about its counterpart, realism. And you'll at least have the basic idea of two basic schools of philosophical thought. Plato, as you can see from the timeline, is the middle of what are referred to oftentimes as the great three classical philosophical thinkers, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. Plato was a student of Socrates, and as we mentioned in our last presentation, we don't know anything about Socrates, or we know very little about Socrates except through Plato. Socrates didn't read or write, and what we have about him we know mostly through Plato. And Aristotle was a student of Plato, and we'll see next in the next presentation how different Aristotle is from Plato, whereas Plato is very similar in orientation and thought to Socrates. Plato lived during a time of great societal change. You can see from the bottom of this timeline the kinds of things that were going on. He was born at the beginning of his birth was towards the beginning of the Peloponnesian War, where Sparta defeated Athens, and that plays a huge role in Plato's thinking, especially in the Republic. So as I said, that there was this time of great change that was going on in Athens at the time, and a lot of the blame for the defeat of Athens by Sparta was laid at the feet of the leaders at the time. And so what Plato was doing in the Republic was outlining what a republic, what a city-state should look like. It was going to be able to prosper, but also if it was going to be able to defend itself. So what should a city-state look like? What should truth look like in the midst of great change? So if you keep that in mind as you're reading the Republic, he is very interested in what kind of a society would stand the test of time, what kind of society would bring satisfaction and fulfillment to its citizens. You will see this, this is a very small part of a larger painting of painting titled The Academy, and you'll see two figures at the middle of it. One is Plato and the other is Aristotle. And you'll see the significance of this, especially as we talk about Aristotle next week. But Plato is the figure on the left and Aristotle the figure on the right. And notice the position of their hands. Plato, his finger is pointing upward, and Aristotle's hand is pointing straight forward. And that corresponds to the two basic orientations that they had towards knowledge and truth. Plato thought that the real world was a world of ideas, the world that existed above and was eternal. Aristotle was a realist and thought that the real world was a world that we see, and we look at the real world and from that deduce what we believe about reality. And we'll again talk more about this next week when we talk about Aristotle. But again, if you get the idea, the realists believe there's something called truth. It exists independent of this world, and you can see it and understand it by thinking about it. And realism, the world that's in front of you, is all that we have about knowledge and truth, and we deduct truth from what we see and observe. Plato was born 423 BC, died 75 years later. He was the founder of the Academy in Athens, the first educational institution of higher education. And as I mentioned, most of what we know about Plato, we know through his writings and these dialogues that he wrote. So some things that he wrote in his own name and some things that he wrote in the person of Socrates. So as I mentioned before, we can see that his philosophical orientation was in response to the chaos that he saw around him. And as a result, he actually ended up, some people say he hated democracy, because democracy doesn't have in it the structure, the strength, the support necessary to be able to stand up to the forces that might attack it. So even though Athens is considered to be the cradle of democracy, Plato was dubious about whether or not a democratic state could exist. and without some kind of a ruling elite that would be in charge. And we'll see that as we read the Republic. Now, as I said before, we're going to use some very technical kinds of terminology in this course. And I think you can get a handle on it pretty easy. And there's not a lot of terms, so I'd like you to concentrate on these three. Philosophy is divided into three major branches: metaphysics, epistemology, and axiology. Metaphysics has to do with reality and answers the question, what is real? Epistemology deals in the area of knowledge. That is, how do we know things? How do we come to understand the nature of reality? And axiology has to do with values. How do you become good? What is right? What is wrong? And each of the philosophical branches that we will take a look at will answer that question. The category of metaphysics. The thing then is that in a changing world, what is true is ideas. And so the metaphysical world, the real world, is the world of ideas. And so, as I said earlier, idealism might be a better way to say this. And so that these ideas are basically the thoughts that make up the fundamental aspects of reality. And that the only thing that we know for certain, for sure, is our consciousness, is what we can think of. And the world outside of that is unsure because it changes. Famous quote is that nobody dips their foot into the same river twice because everything has always changed. And so for Plato, ideas are the real and the unchanging. And the physical world changes all the time, and we can never be sure of it. We will use this chart to kind of keep track of our philosophers. We will put Plato in the idealism category. And we talk about it being a dualistic way of looking at life because there is ideas and there is a quote-unquote physical world, but the real world is the world of ideas. So, idealism and epistemology, the universe is rational and orderly, and it's therefore intelligible. And we can get at this real world through dialogue, conversation, thinking. That's why the dialogues are the sole foundation for arriving at truth in Plato and Socrates. In fact, if you read enough of these, you'll get the idea that you really don't need anything else except a conversation partner. And two people putting their heads together can think their way through. So, in epistemology, we would call Plato an internalist, a intuitiveness, believing that you rely on intuition to figure out what is right in this world, knowable in this world, excuse me. And then axiology, again, what is virtue? What is good is living virtuously by following reason. So you think things through, and then you live on the basis of what you think, of the conclusions that you've come to. And reason will lead to the good, which ultimately leads to beauty. So how do you live the good life? Well, you think things through, and then you live all according to the dictates of your conscience, so the dictates of reason through the course of history. And we will not necessarily talk about any of these folks, but just here for you to observe. Descartes, Augustine, Berkeley, Immanuel Kant. We will talk about him, Hegel, and Emerson. These are all individuals who followed Plato, in that they didn't follow the real world and look at the real world and then draw their conclusions about life from that. They intuited a lot of what they knew, which is a very simplistic way of looking at things, but it gives you the idea of this major category of thought. So that, a very basic introduction to Plato and his thinking, and I hope that helps set the context for what we're going to read in the Republic.